Hello. The microphone is working. Let me. Kate is grabbing something. We are very happy to be here, dear Kolja, dear Angela. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much also for your kind introduction. Well, this morning I almost had arrived late because we have a lot of criticism going on, harsh criticism against the climate policies of our government, because probably we will not be able to exercise the trade of criticism because no longer our planet will exist. Our topic is more narrow today. You have been presented briefly, but we will come back to the way in which you work. So I would ask you, I will switch back and forth between German and English, yes. So I would ask you to elaborate more on your working environment. How do you work? Because not everybody will be in the picture about this. I think the critics among ourselves, well, they have not been at the first conference on the critique or the crisis of critique or the future of critique. There was an essay that was James Elkin's What Happened to Art Criticism? That was the title of that essay. In this essay, he dealt with the problem of the condition of critique as a sort of deterioration or also diminishment of the later blooming times or blossom of criticism. So he stated that critique or art critique is in decay. Do you share this view? Elkins back then believed that art critique had deteriorated over time. And one of his points was, and I quote, art criticism is massively produced and massively ignored. So he believed we had an excess quantity of criticism. No one would take it up, and let alone use it or implement it. Since then, 2006, this small booklet appeared. The production of criticism has even been on the increase. Many more journalists, journals, podcasts, and media formats. Let me start out by asking you a very simple question, i.e., what type of art criticism do you consume? Which forms of journals, articles, Instagram accounts, podcasts do you receive, do you consume? How do you inform? Kate, would you like to start out?
Thank you. I'm happy to be here today. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I guess being the only person who works in journalism in sort of a traditional sense, I've become quite reliant on aggregators, which is not to say that that is where one finds the most criticism these days, but because of my job, which is to obviously like pay attention to quote unquote everything, and there is so much of everything, you know, news aggregator tools have become quite useful. And I bring that up because it's not about searching on Twitter, it's about other tools that really give you a more time-based feed of what is going on. So I usually end up reading stuff through there just because of my work. And this, of course, does not necessarily lead me to the most critical content, but it brings up topics that then, of course, one can triangulate with critical analysis, hopefully, through different writing. And in terms of like criticism itself, you know, I was thinking about the question, it's difficult to end up on websites these days, like on a homepage, which is something I think we'll like talk about later. But I try to look at some of these younger critical websites, like, you know, 4 Columns is one. There's like a new one called like the Manhattan Art Review. There's Caesura, there's the White Pube, and these sorts of websites are often either run by individuals or small groups. They don't often track much you know, they don't go viral, but this to me is like a really exciting place. I'd almost like liken it to, it has the same sort of vitality as like the project space scene in a way, where, and I don't know that longevity is necessarily like packed into them, but they are really interesting places to run into content. I also, of course, I'm like everyone else, finding that podcasts are some of the most rigorous places for analysis. I'm a big fan of Josta Trella and new models, of course. I also, you know, think it's really important, especially since 2016, I tried to like make sure that I find things, and it takes a lot of work because of algorithms to like find things that you have to take a combative stance with. So, you know, I try as much as I can to like follow things that I don't readily agree with, whether it's like a critic's position or not. Like I think an example of that is like, there's this critic, you could call him like Adam Lehrer, and he's quite an edgelord and a polemical type. I disagree with most of what he says, but I try to like pay attention to him too, or Glenn Greenwald if you're looking at the news. So yeah, I guess it's kind of like asking someone like what they eat for breakfast. It changes and it's kind of sporadic, but that's the best sort of take I could give.
Thanks so much. That was very thorough, and that I think that's an excellent start, because it also shows how many sources you have to tap. That you can't just, you know, I guess when Holger and I were still working at newspapers, in the beginning, sort of our daily routine would start with filing through the daily German newspapers and then maybe some English or French newspapers, filing through them, and then sort of maybe going into the internet. But that was our routine, and I think that's, I mean, we all realized also when we were still working at the newspapers that that doesn't make sense anymore, and we were also starting reading aggregators and so forth. So one more question is, so that's probably something you do not only for breakfast, but throughout the entire day. There is no specific time when you do that kind of tapping sources, right? I mean, this is probably something, a continuous process through the entire day and weekend.
Yeah, I mean, also, there's like alerts, right? So I follow certain topics. If there's something unfolding, you know, controversy, then I usually make a Google alert and that'll signal us. But I think in general also, like, editorial rooms are really socially networked now. It's not just through email, but we're Slacking, which is, you know, basically like a social media channel for office spaces. And there's all these different channels of different topics that people are like dropping things into. I mean, yeah, time is a precious resource, and it's incredibly difficult to pay attention to everything. So it's scattergun throughout the day, I guess.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate. Would you like to continue, Alex?
Sure, yeah. I think, I mean, for me, I started working, you know, in legacy media. So I worked at the London Review of Books and then at Art Forum, and I still read them, and I read kind of Book Forum and Spike, where I worked as well. So I'm, you know, I do believe in the magazine form, and I don't think it's over, but it becomes part of a, you know, there has been this sort of decentralization where there's, you know, where aggregators or like, you know, new models is super important for like for this sense of being in touch with certain things that are happening in culture. And I think that this kind of decentralization is, I don't know, I mean, it affects mostly the sort of short-term kind of quick-fire response. I mean, I was thinking a lot, I forget who brought it into my thought universe, but this idea that there are these different time scales, so you have like the sort of tweets and blogs and this kind of thing, and then newspapers, magazines, you know, and then to books, and that each of them have a different kind of level of cultural effect, so that, you know, now I've ended up mostly working with books, although we also do a magazine. But this idea that like books have a kind of generational reach, and that there's this kind of day-to-day news that then operates on a much shorter time frame. And I think it has become, or it always was, a question of like how you prioritize your time, because the minute takes are like, you know, they are fighting for your attention by design. So to resist that has, I think, become more important. And I think, you know, even a physical magazine is a way of slowing that down and not having that pressure. So, yeah, I don't know. So I think, yeah, I read legacy media and support them and think that they should be supported and read. You know, but then also I'm not immune from things that go viral or sent to me or being discussed by other people. It kind of happens organically and comes from all kinds of places.
The magazine you're publishing, how often is it being published?
It's now twice a year.
Twice a year. So it's a different cycle from Kate's cycle a lot. Is that a relief? Does it feel like a relief?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, well, it's a different, you know, it's the same cycle of like deadline pressure when it happens, but it's more drawn out, so yeah.
Okay. Holger, I mean, I guess you also have to explore a bit, because you're doing two things, right? I mean, you have to cover what is being said about the institution you work for, and you have to dig for topics that could be topics in the magazine you're publishing. So I guess these are two different sources, two different perspectives.
Ja, also erstmal möchte ich mich herzlich für
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Well, I am sort of in a position where I have crossed the Jordan from journalism to communications. There is no way back, you would have said in the past today. The world has become more complex. Yes, we do produce twice a year a magazine, a legacy magazine. But, well, I try to read everything, to get hold of everything. Thanks to the institution, the Staatliche Kunstsammlung in Dresden, we have a focus around breakfast time. We have our in-house service that serve all the articles where your institution is mentioned, ready for snapping it up. But still, I try to read all the major newspapers, legacy media. I like this term, legacy media, the daily newspapers. As a quick aside, I think in the world of art, we may discuss this in all players, even be it museums or galleries, collectors, artists, you name it, and even auction houses. To the present day, we have just a limited number of legacy media that produce the relevant articles and pieces that are read by everyone. At least for Germany, this holds true. These are just few newspapers, which does not mean that there isn't a breathtaking diversity of voices that you need to perceive. I work in a short, let's say, gerontocracy, in hierarchy of museums. You read, of course, the FAZ or the Süddeutsche Zeitung, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. But as a matter of fact, I would say, yes, there are reasons why these are still the valid and validating organs, end of aside. Still, I try to keep up with debates that are still in the making, because probably they might be the platform for a new upcoming or emerging topic. I do not know whether I have to mention cases and point, but I still find, I have always tried to find my way out of my own bubble. It's fairly easy just to follow certain channels in the social media. Don't read just the things that have a reference to your own institution or to your own person, which would be a rather autistic exercise. My task is, well, we are a subordinate authority of the Free State of Saxony next to Berlin. How many museums? 15 museums or collections, and 2 also from Berlin that have joined the fray with us. But in other words, this means I need to talk a lot to politicians, and I need to bear in mind and to be aware of politics. I need to talk also to political journalism, not just art journalism. I would be grateful if we could agree on a definition of criticism, because I think it's too vague. We talk so much about criticism, it's just content production. What is criticism after all? How can we define it? I would greatly appreciate it. I need to have an extrasensorial perception for so many things that are going on underneath the horizon. I try to keep up with so many debates. These debates do not relate to our magazine. It has the title August or August, so it's important. Museums are also broadcasters due to based on the exhibits, on the publications and the press campaigns. We are responsible for those press campaigns. But on the other hand, there is a need for even more communication, because effectively, without falling into the trap of nostalgia, it's a quantitative matter of fact, we have less and less critics. So we felt the need to communicate more urgently our own things. We do not want to produce a corporate magazine, another museum journal, nor did we want to enter into competition with art critics. We invite artists, directors, producers, whether they want to pick just one work of art from our collections and to write on this from a very personal perspective. So this is not linked to the ongoing debates. This is just one of our tools to produce an exciting magazine, but it's not a competition to legacy criticism, rather poems.
Yeah, maybe I'd like to pick up your notion that there's too much talk about criticism and too little defined. My question would be, we were all announced as art critics, and you intervened and you said, I'm not an art critic, please don't announce me as an art critic. But I think it can be a kind of sloppy term, and so my next question would be whether you still identify with the term art critic, and if not, or if so, why, and if not, how would you call yourself? Maybe Alex, you'd like to start.
I mean, I wouldn't really call myself a critic now. I do call myself an editor, and in a way, I've always identified mostly as an editor.
So you intervened as well?
I did intervene as well. I think we all said like that critic's not quite right for us.
You all intervened. I'm the only critic here. I see. Okay.
And I think, you know, I mean, what I do now, or it's, you know, that there's also been in marketing this push away from marketing towards content. That you see, you know, that you see in in-flight magazines are also trying to make good magazines, and you know, and then, you know, there's this. I mean, for where I am now with Hauser and Wirth has, you know, 10 to 15 books a year. So we really like run this publishing house and used to collaborate with other publishers to run make books, and then kind of took that in-house. And I think there's a lot of this taking things in-house. There's a lot of kind of, you know, it's like sort of, yeah, content instead of, I mean, it's to do with the branding. It's, you know, Red Bull makes its own magazine in the German-speaking countries, and it's kind of like, you know, is a very indirect form of kind of like giving, I mean, it's about like reaching people, connecting to people, and you know, and I think that this kind of idea of criticism is not really, I mean, you know, we do more kind of art history things, also like the artist's voice plays a big role. And the old-fashioned criticism, I mean, we're not the place for that any, you know, that other people have to do that. So what we do instead is then also like interviews with artists, or like, you know, publishing Eva Hesse's diaries and this kind of thing. So there's this kind of like, a whole different side. I mean, also, you know, the classic gallery catalogue also invites critics to write, but is what they write criticism. I kind of feel like also that, you know, it doesn't mean it's not interesting what they write, but it's obviously like, you know, it's the point is not to be kind of, it's not about having a neutral position, that there's this myth of a neutral position that, I don't know, that John Kelsey wrote about in the Hack, this idea that, you know, like kind of everyone who works in the art world is somehow impure, because the art world is impure. But there are all of these romantic notions, especially in the art world, of, you know, of the artist being pure, which is also difficult if you have a gallery and come into contact with this kind of like commercial marketing, the rise of like self-branding through social media. There's all kinds of like ways in which it's already impure. So I think that this old idea of criticism is kind of one premised upon a purity that didn't even really exist in the heyday of the Village Voice sort of thing. I mean, they, you know, yeah, I don't know, was that a better, I mean, you know, I lament the loss of the Village Voice, but it's, you know, but I don't think that there's nothing interesting being written. I think there's lots and lots of really interesting things being written now, even though they maybe are not criticism in this old sense. And they are, in fact, amplification. Like, that's kind of what the art world is geared around anyway, you know, like what critics choose to review, what exhibitions are made. They're all done by people who support what they're doing. So there is a logic of amplification already symptomatically in the art world, like what gets chosen to be given space, and what is making a claim on your attention, and what has books published about it, and what has essays written, and which artists are invited to speak.
Thanks also for the for noting that there's this kind of idea of the pure art critic. I must say, I think you're absolutely right that sort of there's always entanglement. But I remember when I was still writing for a newspaper, for example, I thought that it was a pretty pure position or neutral position, in the sense that we didn't, you know, there was no commercial interest. Most of the money of the newspaper would be also generated through other sources, through other advertisements. I mean, we had for our art market section, we would have commercial galleries having advertisements with us, but I thought that actually it was my responsibility as a critic, not, for example, to write for galleries as a side job, and really sort of communicate all the knowledge I had to the readers, and not, for example, I don't know, speak about money and not speak about sort of other things that I would know about. I thought, really, I get paid, I have a guaranteed job, and this comes with responsibility, and the responsibility is absolute sort of transparency. I mean, there are also issues of things you can say and you can't say because they're complicated, and there might be law issues attached. But I think sort of the newspapers for a long time were places where you could do a lot of things you couldn't do outside a newspaper. So I think there are, I don't know, I'm a bit unhappy about the notion that there's entanglement everywhere. I think there are different layers and different, yeah.
Can I just say one short point, though, is that this, I mean, you know, I don't think it's that the amplification is necessarily a bad thing as such, but in the newspapers or in the German feuilleton, then it's also led by a sense that this cultural content deserves this space. So it's also about amplifying a certain idea of what the importance of art is for society, and the importance of it being spoken about and given space, which is something that has then shrunk in the newspapers. But you know, at the same time as art itself has been amplified through things like Tate Modern as a tourist attraction and so on. So there's this, you know, I mean, I think that's you know, interesting about newspapers, and also like why it should have shrunk, sort of thing. It's important and maybe it is to do with that there are other venues who are doing more of it. Maybe it's, I don't know. I mean, I do see what you mean, but I think it's also like to do with a sense of cultural importance that is then also amplified through buildings and writing and so on.
Just to pick up on the idea of where the newspapers being the place where there was this more like pure form of criticism, which I think is quite true, and I would say now it's maybe not in online websites as much, is because of the way in which criticism was placed. You know, I mean, I've spoken about this before, but it was a bunch of guesswork ultimately, like how much someone was actually engaging with something. You know, someone's picking up a newspaper because of what's on the front cover, but everything else that's inside of it is sort of the editor's best guess of like what's going to be relevant. The choices that are made next are maybe dictated by letters to the editor. For example, I think, you know, and we'll probably talk about it later in terms of how it affects amplification, but as soon as you put a piece of criticism online, you have a devastating amount of information about it, and also you have a devastating amount of information about how it bounces off against advertisements, how it bounces off against brand-safe advertisements, especially if you're writing about something that is maybe quite difficult or sensitive, such as Documenta was. You know, advertisers don't want to be anywhere near the keyword anti-Semitism for many reasons. So yeah, I do think that I never worked for a newspaper, but I do think that that has something to do with that shift. I guess just to answer like why I also asked not to be called an art critic is I've never really understood the parameters of it, you know, or maybe they're a bit problematic in a way, like who gets ordained as such and who vets that. I mean, I guess also nowadays too, it seems more and more that it's about who can afford to be an art critic. Especially as you know, New Model spoke about in their keynote speech. I mean, the pay per word has declined so drastically. I think there's no small wonder why all of you have probably naturally shifted away from these places, you know, and that really affects who has time and resources to write about it, because oftentimes it then falls back on people who maybe come from positions of privilege. So if that's what art criticism, or if that's what the critic job, you know, was stemming from, then it doesn't really make sense for me either. Also, of course, this idea of, as you were saying, like purity and expertise. I mean, this idea that an artwork is something that is delivered from some sublime place and the public doesn't know, and that there's some person who's going to like deliver the message to you like an angel Gabriel or something, is just like has a lot of flaws. And I think it's really hard. I think all of us have mourned the like lack of good writing that has, you know, come with all of this, but I don't think that there's been a lack of good thinking. You know, I think that it's been decentralized, it's been deformalized, but it's also been like become part of like, it's become kind of like populist or something. Like everybody, as you know, John Miller was saying, everybody's sort of become a critic, and that's destabilizing, but it's not bad. So, yeah, so I do criticism. I've written criticism. I've edited criticism. But I don't know that I would more subscribe to like writer, journalist, editor, who does criticism. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Now I feel peer pressure to switch to English too.
No, please.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I tried. No, it's fine. I try. I mean, it has been talked about the gatekeeping function of the big newspapers before, and you know, who can call himself art critic. That's not exactly what I meant. I get that they're kind of representative for a certain bohemian lifestyle culture that is maybe 20th century, but they're still at work and it still works. So that's not the point. The point I'm trying to make is who gets to. I mean, everybody is able to put their position and their meaning out there today. And you know, from my experience, especially, I think there's a need to make differences between, you know, what experts say from wherever they speak, from wherever they make their point, and everybody else, because. From the other perspective, there's a lot of aversion against experts, especially in social media. And you know, in Germany, there's this word Expertokratie, which means, you know, oh, these are experts, you know, snobs, so to speak. And you know, there's also a lot of campaigning. I mean, that's maybe the most objective word you can find. When we're talking about amplification, this is, I think, a big problem, and it's directed towards experts wherever they are who represent maybe a certain institution, maybe museums, maybe also journalism, and there's a big aversion against, you know, legacy media these days, and that's what worries me, because. My institution has been also subject to campaigning regarding certain issues, and I'm watching these things very closely. And so I think what I'm only trying to say is that I think there's a need to defend, you know, expertise also in criticism against very aggressive Meinungsmache, you know.
Campaigning, maybe. Yeah, I mean, the sort of a notion whether we are nostalgic or romantic, or we sort of, there's this idea of pureness has come up several times, and whether the sort of what kind of figure the art critic is. And I must say, although I just defended kind of the classical newspaper art critic position, I must also say, coming from a feminist perspective, I'm not nostalgic at all. I don't have the feeling like there were good old days and it was much better, and it was all about argument and debates, and all these beautiful men, you know, did it perfectly, and then came social media and this feminist and ruined it, you know. I mean, I think we have a lot of cases we could discuss, and for example, things like recently Helen Moldsworth's Death of an Artist podcast, that didn't come through legacy media. Things like Nan Goldin, Payne Seckler campaign, that didn't come through legacy media. So in a way, there is a notion of criticism that is much stronger, much more effective, much more widespread than it has ever been. So I would like to know from you whether you have a certain degree of nostalgia, or whether you think sort of what has happened has sort of redistributed criticism in a different way, but it doesn't mean that it was sort of better in the good old days.
I mean, I've just been thinking for this last exchange about how much kind of art's own role has become to kind of carry this social criticism or internal criticism, that is something that has been outsourced to artists. You know, I was thinking during the discussion of Sarah's Tilted Arc before about that David Hammond's piece called Pissed Off, where he pissed up against a Sarah sculpture and then was arrested, and there are these amazing photos of it. And that kind of thing, you know, is something, you know, I mean, I think then it's also a kind of paradox that then Hauser und Wirth represents Gustav Metzger, who like was deeply against the commercial art world and had this idea of the art strike, where there's one thing I just want to quote from him about that, which was, he says, "The building up of the artist as a heroic and mythical figure by means of reproductions and massive publication is a trend of our century that I very much opposed. We have seen the development of an intricately organized machinery, eine Verfilzung, between the artist, the business and dealer world, the media communication, the publishers and the collectors, produce an explosion of works and products." So there's this kind of deep criticism of the art world that now is then part of the art world too. So there's that kind of, I mean, I think that's part of this kind of redistribution, that it's like, you know, and then there's also kind of yeah, I don't know where that then leaves the kind of writing about it. It kind of leaves it partly in the artist's hands, sort of thing.
Yeah, that's interesting. Also that there's artistic research, and that often also means that institutions employ artists to do a kind of put up a kind of critical perspective on their institutions. And I know some artists are very unhappy about this, that it's sort of put in their hands rather than in the hands of historians or journalists.
I think there is this sort of spectre of a sort of frictionless art world, where then there's the critics are no longer critical and everyone agrees that these artists are great, that there's this kind of different separate debate about canon building that I guess we don't have time to get into. But yeah, I don't know. But then within this frictionlessness, where everyone supports and promotes and recognizes the value of art itself as a structure and of the artists who are kind of recognized and esteemed, and then there's sort of who's brought into that discussion and things like that, where then, yeah, I don't know, where then the artists themselves create the friction within the system, because the system needs friction in order to proceed and to, you know, continue to be relevant. Because it's all, for me, a lot of this discussion of amplification is about how do you know, you have to re-legitimize, the art world has to reinvent itself all the time and assert why it's still relevant, sort of thing, against the danger of becoming irrelevant when people are more interested in, you know, other things like, I don't know, whatever.
Like?
Like digital collectibles or...
Holger.
I think that's a super important point. Although, of course, some artists might feel challenged if they work for an institution and are asked to do interventions, I think often it's a very valuable and good way to get a new perspective on your own collection and on issues that come with being a museum today. I mean, we have asked Emeka Ogbo to do a piece on the Benin bronze we possess and we are negotiating and giving back right now. And he came up with an idea that I found great. It was from it was installed in the city as a public artwork from, I think, December 20 to January 21. He put up like some of the Benin bronzes. He made like posters in the city, and there was a big headline, "Vermisst." So, from a Nigerian perspective, they were missed. So, and they were all over the place, all over the city, which is a way, you know, only maybe an idea only an artist can come up with, and he makes a strong point. Against the museum or with the museum, it's ambiguous, and that's what's great about that work. So sometimes you have like the artist as, of course, as putting up institutional critique, as it started from whenever, the 70s. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Was there what were the art critical pieces that were written about that? Were there interesting reactions to it?
I'm afraid not so much. The problem, that's why we did this magazine, because the first magazine came out in the second lockdown. That's also when I started in Dresden. Everything was locked down. The city was closed. No one really saw that post, which was really sad, you know. But that's why we did this magazine. The first issue was on loneliness. And you know, the artists had to write about loneliness on our pieces, and we put up, you know, we put up an article ourselves in the first issue about the Emeka Ogbo intervention. But there were a few articles which were actually quite, you know, positive in their reaction, but not the way we would have thought. But at that time, I think it was a special situation with the lockdown being on.
I want to know from Kate, is there any kind of nostalgia you're feeling for good old days or not?
I mean, I think I really agree with what Holger was saying too. I think that there is, I'm sad to see the kind of like how expertise is reviled, you know? Like, I'm happy to see that there is more people that feel empowered to be critical and to like, you know, do gestures of criticism in whatever their form, and I'm encouraged that it's sort of unchained itself from the written word, even though I'm like dedicated my career to that, and that's all okay. I guess I just wish there was a little bit more tolerance towards like old frameworks, because I think that we can build new ones without tearing them completely down. So, yeah.
We touched upon it, and Holger, you did, and I'm afraid this question goes directly to you, because I think you have had the most experiences for that. We have talked a little bit about the logic of amplification. We talked about things that went viral, and going viral can be a good or can be a bad thing, and if it's a really bad thing, it's a shitstorm. And you had experiences with that coming into a shitstorm. Maybe you could talk about this experience, because it has the logic of amplification, unfortunately, and what are the lessons to learn from that?
I'm traumatized. No. Da muss ich wieder Deutsch reden, weil das ist sonst zu kompliziert.
Now I have to switch to German, otherwise it would be too complicated for me. The interesting thing about such shitstorms, I would rather talk of campaigns, because they come from different directions. Because on the one hand, in order to function well, they need to decontextualize of fact-based evidence towards a catchy phrase. It must be suitable for mean ends or media ends. They need to create a narrative that goes on its own, even down to fake news. The second thing that is needed to create a good shitstorm is the mobilization of the followers in the respective bubble. At the beginning, with a certain push from legacy media, some headlines in the legacy media, but then passing them around directly to the users. You will not find any traces of that mechanism in the normal or legacy media world. It becomes a self-propelled lump, and it ends up as a self-propelling grenade. Just an example. Well, could you please mention? Well, I just wanted to introduce it in abstract terms. We do what many museum groups, networks with our department Daphne. We update titles of work of arts, and we explore also those things that are on the signs and on the various plaques that we attach underneath a painting or so. Normally, it's not an original legacy title. Before 1850, never would an artist give a title to their own work. Look at the boom of newly built museums in the 19th century. Then you will understand. During colonialism, many work titles were assigned, and you feel it judging by the wording of those titles. We need to contextualize it. We need to mark it as historically produced, and we need to contextualize it. Many museums do this. It's the normal routine to change certain titles. For example, if the person painted is not the person highlighted by the plug, then we had a request by the AfD party, and these small requests are political institutions or tools that are quite frequently used by the opposition parties to get information from the governments. We are bound to provide information. Left idolatry because certain discriminatory titles of works were changed or were contextualized. We do not delete the previous titles. Idolatry. SKD, the Staatliche Kunstsammlung in Dresden, have changed their titles. A huge tabloid then provided assessment. They said, the Staatliche Kunstsammlungen are worse than the Taliban. We were equated with vandalism and iconoclasm. So that was the tone that was set for the entire debate. And then something was unleashed that normally you would call a shitstorm. We were the matter of a shitstorm. We were in the fangs of an outrageous mob. And how do you get notice of it? Emails or on the website? Where do you find? In the Google rankings or in the visitor service, try to Google yourself or on Google, and there is a ranking, and it was striking to see so many bad rankings and foul attributes attached to us in the Google ranking. In the social media, anyway. Lexi Media then take it on, adopt this. This is the classical amplification. Something was created in a different way, but it bounces back to the newspapers. The newspapers unleash it, and then it bounces back and is fed back into the legacy media. We have tried to objectivize it, to tone it down. We made it clear you cannot counter this wave with this tool. So we continued saying it's a standard routine. This is in line with our basic law, the Grundgesetz. We have tried to explain it. For example, 16 Madonna was given in 1687, not by Raphael itself. So many N words or M words date back to those times. They need to be changed. Well, for example, representation of Jewish people that need to be contextualized. We think it's to be taken for granted that you do this, but we face so much criticism and also headwind, similar to the asterisk, the gender asterisk, gender speak. There is an outraged group that says this is the decay, utter decay of our culture. Is there anything we can learn from it? Is there anything that you would tell us? Well, you have withstood and withered the storm at least once? Can you weather such shitstorms better? Well, we have our sensors out there. I would say such a heavy shitstorm is difficult to predict. It is inflamed with arbitrary things, things that you would take for granted. It flames up with your everyday research routine, and then it leaves you with awe and shock. You can not do anything else but continue in your sensible practice. You have to withstand this headwind. So you sense it somehow. There is something right about your action. Certain people are up in arms against contextualization. Others would criticize that you are too slow. You need to negotiate between the two sides. Why isn't it the other museums that are at the center of this home? Why just us? That's what I wondered repeatedly.
Hear Holger talk about that. I mean, we didn't cover it extensively, but of course, I think journalists and media were often the catalyzers of shitstorms that break out. And this is also in thinking about the theme today of like the logic of amplification, like where you're talking about these like online mobs. I guess the pressure goes on journalists and media organizations to like get ahead of them, right, and to capture that audience, which then has a perpetuating factor. Like you push stuff out quickly if you're not editing properly, and you maybe make more mistakes and perpetuate more bias or polemical discussion. Yeah, I mean, I think we saw that a lot in the German media around Documenta too, and it was interesting because that's something that we covered more extensively than what happened at SKD. Just like really having to like take a minute and take a cool-headed approach and just gather and just know that that was maybe going to mean that you were going to like miss the crush of that wave, but that you would actually like, hopefully, if it was successful, like cover things like at least accurately as to like what was happening, yeah, so.
That was interesting, yeah, and I wonder how it relates. I mean, it's this very short time like distortion of the sort of response to something that you're doing. It creates its own momentum, and then very quickly it's like a wave that crashes. I think that's an interesting simile. But I wonder how that relates to sort of the longer term changes of like the reputations of artists, of institutions, of like maybe even this generational thing. But I think if you look at, to take Haus am Wörth example, if you look at their promotion of Eva Hesse and Lee Lozano and this kind of like idea of correcting the canon by like bringing more women into it, that's also something that is like, there are levers that make it work, and there's there are different levers to this social media sort of quick kind of dopamine hit of jumping onto a wave. But there are also kind of like these mechanisms of amplification that happen in different scopes. So like the sort of shitstorm is a short one, but then canon formation is another, where then books and museums and museum exhibitions and gallery exhibitions and all these things also kind of like this kind of like amplification is it's a tool sort of thing, or it's something that you can partly control, I guess, by having publications, by by doing good work, by like sort of through kind of editing and then what you feature sort of thing. So I just wonder if those two levers are kind of like connected, or if we're like I mean, I think that they are somehow, that we're not just at the victim of what happens online, but there's also this kind of like, how can you structure the longer term thing so that it hopefully doesn't all become meaningless or irrelevant?
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah, it's super interesting. I think it comes down to creating economic structures that allow for that like longer term critical analysis or shifts that you're talking about to like be sustainable, right? And I think that's why, like museums doing publications like August, or, having art critics working in galleries, well, it's just too easy to criticize that, because I think what it allows is it gives time and resources to critical thinking. Whether it introduces a bit of bias is kind of a moot point, because it was always there, in some senses. So yeah, and I think like, in general, a lot of these publications and all kinds of publishing houses in any sense, like, really need to diversify their economic models so that, you know, speaking from ArtNet, obviously the way we sustain ourselves is on the 24-hour news cycle, and that allows for more expensive investigative reporting and analysis, which, you know, would otherwise be unsustainable too.
I think it's interesting what you said about, you know, what you both said about the long-term strategies. I think for museums, it's clear that they also have to adapt and change and to transform their model. I mean, there are multiple challenges, of course, like for every institution right now. But I think it's kind of foreseeable, or at least logical, that there is, when you do something like that, there will be a conservative rollback in that sense. But, you know, in the concrete situation, it's not foreseeable in that way. But of course, we also have to adapt, and we have also to continue our work. Yeah, I mean, we face also the challenge. I don't know should I bring that up, the climate activists, but yeah.
Should I say no?
That's why, because what John Miller said before, I found that interesting. I mean, it's for museum institutions, it's not only symbolic, not at all. I mean, even if there is real damage, and even if the museum is closed, you know, for a few hours, it's in the thousands already. But if you neglect even that, I mean, you have to understand what all museums are discussing right now. I mean, it's a security architecture that is. I mean, what Barberini did might be a role model for the future. There are profilers in the halls. There is like an airport situation, because, you know, if it has been done at almost every major European museum, and we're all scared and we want to protect our collections, and they're not all behind glass, and there are follow-ups from random people, you know, who might do the same but not with glass. So we're trying. What we're trying right now is to secure that the museum experience will be the same in the future, and that is not clear yet right now. So there is a real consequence of what they're doing, and actually strategically, frankly speaking, I don't understand why artworks are a valuable target in that sense, because everybody's talking about the artworks and everybody's talking about putting them in jail, and nobody's talking about the climate. So I don't get the point really to go into a museum.
But
moreover, one more point: museums are the most vulnerable public places, and you know, es ist ein kostbarer Schatz, den wir hüten.
It's a valuable treasure that we are guardians of. That's our job. Once you attack the museums, you attack also the museum experience in the future.
Like the logic of amplification, that they use the artwork in order to amplify their own message, and then also, I think, especially in terms of museum work, that there's this idea of the Kostbarkeit, the like preciousness of the artwork. That there's, you know, that there isn't social consensus about that anymore necessarily. You know, there used to be, or, you know, there is in broad parts of society, but it doesn't go without question that that's, you know, that the artwork is holy. In the, you know, for these activists, it you know, I mean, it kind of is, because they kind of need it to be for them, for their strategy of amplification to work.
Very problematic if there was real damage. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I think it's really unprecedented in a way, because you cannot, like, no amount of critical writing will cool it down, because it has done something quite new, which is that no matter, it's not really about what's being said about these attacks, it's just that they're being written about at all is just perpetuating them more and more. So it's you see kind of like a breakdown of what criticism can do in terms of actually really, you know, bringing together these three things of art, climate, and the vulnerability of museums. And even if there is criticism, I think that because these protesters, which are by and large younger people that are digitally native, are just like so tapped into like the mechanics of virality that it's almost like you can't can't even, you're so busy, at least we are, trying to keep track of what is even happening, that it becomes really hard to like devote resources to an analysis, and then in the end an analysis and an article about its occurrence are like sort of perpetuating more attacks anyway. So it just sort of, the whole thing kind of has been collapsing. Yeah.
I'd like to open also for the audience, and one thing I would like to bring in here is also there were two responses which I thought, oh, this is really a good response to that, and that was in Hannover im Sprengelmuseum. Spieler, the director, said, you know, he doesn't appreciate what the activists are doing, but he fully underlines and understands their issues, so he would like to invite them to discuss with him how the museum could be a platform for their issues, rather than saying, you know, the museum is no platform for that. It's like, you know, can we work on a solution that you can use my platform, because it is a media platform, but not in that way. And the same response came also from the Natural History Museum, from Johannes Vogel, the director, who did the same thing and has already long time ago invited Fridays for Future to meet in his museum and have their meetings there. So I thought that was an adorable response to that.
What can I say? You vandalized our artworks, come in. I don't know. But the thing is, also maybe museums are the wrong targets, because, I mean, at least we have 15 collections, and we're trying to be sustainable, and we're working towards a paperless office, and we're sitting in, not cold, but fine, we're fine, but you know, the artworks have to be secured in a climate corridor, which is more important than our offices, you know. You know, there are all kinds of things we're thinking about, of being, of course, being more sustainable without endangering the artworks. But that's the way, I mean, what the climate activists want, that goes without saying. Of course, we all understand that, right? I wouldn't go so far. I mean, I'm not speaking, you know, for my general director, but I wouldn't go so far as to invite them to discuss. I think they made their point quite clear.
But also, I think that museums are not even they're the collateral damage. Like, it doesn't even seem that they necessarily have an issue with museums per se, or that they feel excluded, or that they feel that they're perpetuating climate change. It's purely amplification. I mean, I was just on a radio segment to talk about these attacks like last week, and it was a North American radio, and they didn't even know about the road blockades here. They didn't know about all these other protests that have been happening, because those don't get picked up by the media. Yeah. For some, it's pure optics is why they're attacking, you know, you guys, as opposed to the headquarters of
picture
BP or whatever, something a bit more relevant.
Interesting. I'd like to open up to the audience if there are questions, commentaries. Yes, please. Yeah. Für die Übersetzung wird das Mikro gebraucht. Und es kommt.
You need to use the microphone for our interpreters, and the microphone is coming towards you right now. I have two questions, but one. The first, my name is Peter Bornheim. 40 years ago, I worked for Kunstwerk Baden-Baden, for Wolkenkratzer Art Journal, for FAZ, and the Hessischer Rundfunk. You know, that's why I might not be the most neutral. Now, sending versus critique. You know, the critique that is embodied here today was established in the 17th and 18th century as a rhetoric discipline but of course the distinction between whether something was found good or bad was actually with the nobility, that they said, okay, this is art and this is not art. So it wasn't the task of those who wrote about it. And in Berlin, Schinkel always emphasized that he doesn't do anything else but putting into practice the handwriting of the king, because he knew that the task of critique is that of the king. And so, of course, I've met a lot of critics during my life who thought that they were the heirs of nobility, that they can distinguish between what is art and what is not art, but most don't actually do that. And now that brings me to my question. The task of critique stems from the fact that the day only has 24 hours, and I need to know, or before I go to the cinema, before I go to the opera, before I go to an exhibition, I want to find out whether I should go there or not. And that is the function or the task of critique, especially that of large newspapers. And that function remains, but it doesn't rely anymore, or it doesn't lie anymore within newspapers, but I don't know where it is. That is my first question. And the second would be whether you as art critics will be replaced by influencers. A lot of facts speak for the fact that a lot of art experts say on Instagram, okay, I was here this evening and it was great. And so, you know, you, for instance, working for the Staatliche Kunstsammlung Dresden, and you say out of the 15 collections, well, 12 of the exhibitions aren't really worth for you to come and look at. I don't think that you'll ever do that, you know. So the first question is, who does that? So if the function of critique can be fulfilled by influencers, and the second question is a lot shorter. So this essay by Kolja and Angela, I think that they wrote that essay, and they take a kind of bird's eye view on peer review in science. So the peer review system in science is basically the freedom of academia or of science become flesh or reality. So do you think that there's a possibility for there to be something like peer reviews in art, so that artists themselves have a kind of peer review system, such as scientists have this peer review system, because the successes of the people who decide between what is art and what is not art is, of course, are the artists. So these are my two questions. So one, will this function be replaced by influencers? And second, do you think that there's a possibility for there to be a peer review system of the freedom of art becoming reality? So influencers are people who market products for money, but products aren't exhibitions. Maybe, you know, you mentioned it earlier, you know, the ranking maybe partially replaced. Did I talk about ranking earlier? Yeah, I love talking about ranking because my general director ranks 44th this year, last year, a little bit lower. But you were talking about the Google ranking during this campaign against you, right? So, well, maybe that also partially fulfills or replaces the function of critics. I don't know. TripAdvisor.
I think influencers, obviously, like as you define it, but then also there's so many spheres of influence. You know, there's like micro influencers that have a huge impact on how someone might decide to understand an art exhibition or decide to go to one or not. I mean, also, I think that the term, and if we're talking about influence, I mean, algorithms to me seem like the most strong influencers of like what you end up deciding to do or not do. I mean, to boil it down to individual opinions is difficult because those are being completely filtered to you, you know?
I würde dazu nur noch sagen, so,
I would like to add that the influencers are important for the future of museum and the position of art. Of course, we need to reach young people. I also know that, you know, there are fewer and fewer people going to the theater, for instance, and it's a bit of a danger that no one will be interested in it anymore. And so we need to find an answer. At Haus an Wirt, we have a learning team that deal with accessibility and outreach. And of course, influencers are a part of that, a part of trying to get people engaged. They might not take over the role of the critics, but they play a role in this ecosystem. And now the second question on peer review, I think, yeah, that is happening. It's happening informally via friendships and visits to galleries or studios, but you know, we no longer produce in a vacuum. But I don't know if there will be this kind of quality control through this peer review mechanism. But there is also feedback, maybe not scientific or academic feedback, but on a more friendship base.
It's interesting to think about also critics and influencer culture too. You know, the kind of like the blue checks and how it's, you know, not enough to just be a good writer now, but it's also to have a platform. And that's not just, you know, about reviled traditional media or whatever. It's also just like having a platform on social media and being heard, and that, you know, adds to your cultural cachet. So I think that that's also bringing necessarily in a way, this is like totally an uninformed opinion, but like bringing the age down of like who are critical influencers, because there's obviously like a certain demographic of people that are going to like be really fluent at like dealing with social media and broadcasting their opinions there.
With exceptions.
Yeah,
I mean, there are also some pretty, sort of older generation people in art criticism that are pretty big on.
And I'm a terrible millennial at that, so I mean, whatever.
Okay, more questions, commentaries. Yes, please.
Hi, I just felt a bit compelled to react to your conversation about the climate protest, because I think it's I think the Hannover example was really interesting in the way that like inviting these people to talk about this, and I'm very worried personally that I think these suggestions about increased security are turning institutions more into spaces of autocracy rather than democracy, and I find it. And this worry about the financial value of artworks so much while everything else around it is falling apart. So that's why I kind of wanted to ask what could be the role of broadcasting or amplification in this, and if you don't see inviting these people as an alternative, I guess it's more addressed towards Mr. Liebs, that like what else can you do about this if you're so dismissive of these suggestions?
I hope I have understood everything. I think you asked about the future of museums in terms of security when it's coming to the consequences of the climate activists, and if there still will be democratic institutions. I mean, that's what worries us in the moment. Of course, we will be in the future a democratic institution. We're trying to secure the openness to to be also a place for debate and a place for I mean, New Models quoted Habermas, the kritische Öffentlichkeit is what comes into the museum, right? I mean, this is what used to come in the museum more clearly, but today it's more complex. But we have always the challenge between protecting the works and showing them, and this is always a risk. Once you put them out of the storage, they're at risk. We know that's our daily business, that's our daily work, and what worries us now is we have more. I mean, it begins with glass, right? So we're putting more works behind glass. So that's fine. You can go into a museum. Many works are behind glass. That's fine. But then we ask ourselves, okay, if there are debates going on, how do we identify possible vandalizations? How do we react? Right? The security guards at the museum are people like you and me. They have no police rights. They are not allowed to interfere violently. I mean, that's very, very important, you know. When the Green Vault was robbed, there were always people telling us, why didn't you shoot? Well, I mean, yes. I mean, we in the former GDR, there were guards who had pistols on, right? So, of course, you can't shoot in the Green Vault. You couldn't make a greater damage, but that's only one point. You know? We won't do that. So we won't be violent in any way. We have to secure this as a safe public place for everyone. But still, we want to protect our works, and that's a dilemma. I don't know if that answers your question. No, not at all. Okay, sorry. Maybe you can elaborate.
But we are also running out of time. And Holger, you raised your hand. Is that a time issue you're raising?
It's a good question if no one else is. But there's another.
But there was also, I think you also raised your hand.
We started late, so let's take another 10 minutes.
Yeah?
Pizzas are already ready.
Then
so
the woman
wondering.
In the back row.
Ich werde es auf Deutsch machen.
I will ask my question in German. Now, first, you know, you mentioned that influencers deal with selling products. I think, you know, a lot of influencers, especially in the art area, have created a public sphere in order to be able to debate about issues which, for instance, people responsible for exhibitions didn't mention, didn't talk about. And I think that's an important distinction. We can't just degrade influencers and say that they only want to sell products, you know. I think what I think is a bit problematic, you know, I mean, what is the public sphere of museums? For whom are these public spheres made? Who has the public sphere of museums? We've just heard that these spaces are extremely important and is the public sphere of Germany or culture, but the question is, who is this public sphere actually available? For who is this available? I don't understand your second question, but the first one I would agree with. Okay, let me try and formulate it in a different way. If you say that institutions such as museums and galleries have cultural features of whatever they represent, and you spoke about a public sphere that is extremely important that we want to safeguard, and my question is, well, who has access to this public sphere? Who has access to this public sphere? Do you mean who has access to the museums? So who comes to your museum? Who is the public that takes place in the museum? Do you want, well, when it's about entry fees, well, it's a difficult debate. I don't know if everyone here in this room knows what the costs are of operating a museum. We need to have the sales from our tickets. If you say that that's the barrier, then, you know, then I just have to say sorry. That's just the way it is. So theoretically, the answer is everyone, right? Museums should be there for everyone. Unfortunately, I can't understand what she's saying because she isn't using the microphone. Okay, the difference is, of course, that the collections are free, but the exhibitions aren't. I don't know if we can really ask of Holger. I don't speak for all German museums. No, I only speak for one museum association. And the exhibitions and the collections are partially all accessible for free, for instance, in the Japanese Palais, but we can't, or Japanese Palace. But of course, also a question that needs to be negotiated between museums and politics. And there are some approaches in Germany that are very successful. For instance, in Berlin, we have the first, you know, Museum Sunday, and the museums are very, very full on these days. And there are certain museums, such as the Humboldt Forum, for instance, that don't charge any entry fees. Only the first 100 days, okay. So we have, you know, time and time again, we have this kind of debate, and Holger would probably also agree that we need to, you know, debate that in the future. But I don't know if Holger really needs to defend entry fees. But I think I thought we were talking about the future of critique. Yes, but of course we talked about the public sphere, and of course, you know, museums would be public spaces if politics would allow free entry, and if society decided to want to finance free entry to museums, then of course it would be good for the public sphere. I need to add something, sorry, but I find that very problematic. You know, a lot of people have this kind of mentality of having access to things for free. Maybe it's also due to the internet. That is, you know, that people want to have information and services for free during a time when newspapers are struggling to survive. Sorry, but some things cost money, and if we continue, or if you want us to continue to protect the treasure, the most valuable goods of our society, you know, open to debate. Of course, museums and, you know, complete. There are also some other things that are worth protecting. Then we need to make an effort, also financial effort, that the state itself can't provide, even though, of course, they subsidize a lot. But museums should become part of education. And if you receive unemployment benefits, for instance, you can't afford to pay 14 euros for an entry ticket. It's an elite kind of assumption that, you know, what you're saying, that people want to have everything for free. No, but we live in a society which on the one hand is very prosperous, and on the other hand also, you know, requires food banks, which is really disastrous. When I was young, that wasn't the case. The money was still enough for paying your rent and buying food. And if we live in such a society, then, you know, and even the UK is seeing that, and it's a super capitalistic system. But education needs to be available for the people, and that the entry for normal exhibitions, you know, not the collections, you know, but the normal, you know, that it needs to be free of charge, in, you know, for educational purposes and not just for the higher 10,000.
Somebody mentioned, and I'm only understanding 75% of this, but the UK museums are in a huge crisis right now. They've been free, but they've been sponsored by very questionable patrons, you know, like Unilever, BP, and these climate activists are angry with that. So, I mean, it's not free, and that's super problematic, and the points you raise are really valid, but they do cost money, and so, you know, this question of like who's paying becomes really difficult.
Und wir haben öffentlich kostenlos zugängliche Sammlungen.
And of course, we have collections that are available publicly. Many of our 15 collections are available for the general public. And of course, I can transmit this message to the German Association of Museums and the German government. But in the spring, we began to make the exhibitions public for free of charge for Ukrainian refugees. We do what we can in order to make it available, but we also need to protect our treasures.
Ja, genau, der Herr im roten Pullover, bitte.
Dankeschön. Oliver Hellhagen.
Thank you, Oliver Hellhagen. I publish Kunstkritikfilm.de, an online portal with criticism of films. I'm very surprised by the notion of criticism that you use. We are talking about a political party of the extreme right, that they abuse museums for political maneuvering, and climate activists using museums. But we have hardly ever talked about the classical art criticism as an information channel to inform the wider audience. This has been going on in that way for 3 days. It was not different in Bonn. So could you please elaborate on the change of the essence of art criticism, the simple fact that no longer can you provide safe information to audience. We have product placement critics flip back and forth between curator, editor, and they write contributions to catalogs. Of course, they want to be on excellent terms with those sponsors. We have a hybridization and also a degradation of the scene, also in the medium. Let's take the Tagesspiegel, loves to place so much product placement that are paid by museums. How should the audience at large retain its confidence, its trust in the art criticism at a time when art critics, how do you finance yourselves? Through money given from sponsors. But it's a very small portal. So I've only followed one extract. Have you listened to the talk by New Models? Most of your questions have been answered.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's precisely the question, like, where has it gone? And I think partially it hasn't gone anywhere, and it's just that it has had to change its form. I don't think that it's tenable to just speak about art inside of a bubble when, as we've been seeing, as the public has been pushing us towards realizing that it just cannot exist only in this sort of self-referential annals of like academic writing. I think it's been partially the audience directing us in that direction of it being not just the canon of criticism anymore, if that makes sense.
I think that does make sense. Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of like, yeah, it's a problem that we all face. Like, you know, like this idea of like who does the work to know what is worth seeing, as opposed to who finances it. I mean, I think that there isn't like, the two are very hard to separate, sure, and you know, but then the question, I mean, I think it's also kind of this old model that there are certain privileged people who have the power to say what is worthwhile. Like, it's kind of also then outsourced to everyone to do it themselves, to figure out which of these voices is plausible to me, which of these institutions is plausible to me and trustworthy, which of these, like, you know, this old idea of the critic as someone who is making judgments that other people follow is also, like, difficult to uphold, because people are very skeptical of the individual voice, you know, usually a privileged man's voice that then, you know, has lost its potential to say, you must see this, it's really important.
Ich glaube schon, dass Ihre Frage übrigens mehrmals hier behandelt worden ist.
I do believe your question has been touched upon repeatedly. Kate has already elaborated on this. There is a piece of art, and then there is the critic, and he or she needs to pass information on to the audience. Well, I certainly do not agree on your judgment about this art critic as a process. Today, probably art critics need to deal much more with social and political issues than in the past. You may regret it. I do not regret it. Historically speaking, I cannot share your view that that in the past there was an elite of art critics. Well, they were not neutral or unbiased, but they were independent. Who was Werner Haftmann, Bill Groman? Well, you can say a lot about those figures. Just look at the mixture of critics. I think let's stick to the male word Kritiker. Our impression is not, my impression has never been that it is a body of exclusively trustworthy people that have the noblest intention to inform me. Well, who informs you well? It's debatable. Well, I think we did talk about these questions. You have reached a different conclusion. It's your right. Of course, we need to ask the question, where does money play a role? I do not know to what extent such questions were debated in the legacy forms of criticism. I would love to see any reviews of the interdependency, also economic interdependencies in the 70s and 80s. I think it's a bad starting point to venture that there were the good old times where those highly respectable and responsible people were active. And they have been replaced and this has been also annotated to people that do product placement and nothing else. Look or listen to the podcast Often Artist by Helen Molesworth. It's a fantastic piece of journalism, if you ask me, and also a fantastic piece of art history that deals primarily with those questions that you have mentioned. Then the 80s, things that were not able to be told. It was about the death of Anna Minietta that jumped out of the window. And what was the role played by Karl Andre? In the old system, you could not touch these issues, and we needed a new system.